In her essay, How It Feels to Be Colored Me, Zora Neale Hurston reflected, "When I sit in the drafty basement that is the New World cabaret with a white person, my color comes. We enter chatting about any little thing that we have in common and are seated by the jazz waiters. In the abrupt way that jazz orchestras have, this one plunges into a number. It loses no time in circumlocutions, but gets right down to business. It constricts the thorax and splits the heart with its tempo and narcotic harmonies. This orchestra grows rambunctious, rears on its hind legs and attacks the tonal veil with primitive fury, rending it, clawing it until it breaks through to the jungle beyond. I follow those heathen, follow them exultingly. I dance wildly inside myself. I yell within, I whoop. I shake my asagi above my head. I hurl it true to the mark, yow! I'm in the jungle and living in the jungle way. My face is painted red and yellow and my body is painted blue. My pulse is throbbing like a war drum. I want to slaughter something, give pain, give death to what? I do not know. But the piece ends. The men of the orchestra wipe their lips and rest their fingers. I creep back slowly to the veneer we call civilization with that last tone. And I find the white friend sitting motionless in his seat, smoking calmly. Good music they have here, he remarks, drumming the table with his fingertips. Thank you, Jerry, for bringing that little reading to my attention. We're talking about jazz today, the people's music, the songs of those who have experienced life as struggle but have learned to be resilient anyway. Jazz is an exclamation of life in the midst of life's pain. It is visceral, even transcending language, to convey a raw kind of power. Jazz is freedom's song. Taking root in places like New Orleans and Chicago, this energetic and powerful form melded many styles of music to emote its honest and immediate expression. Artists like Louis Armstrong, Billie Holiday, Thelonious Monk, Ella Fitzgerald, John Coltrane bear the soul through song. The key mark of jazz is improvisation. It makes sense. Jazz's forebears were those who sang in the cotton fields. No sheet music or instruments at their ready. The song leader had to make it up, following the feel of the music in the attempt to survive the soul-crushing reality. Improvisation stuck as jazz musicians bring all that they are to the moment, playing with the kind of intensity that only comes from the most honest kinds of self-expression. While many forms of music call the musician to emulate what the master has preserved on a page, jazz is the exact opposite. It calls the musician to bring forth what is within oneself. With that in mind, and as we continue in this series entitled The Faith We Sing, I would suggest to you today that the Apostle Paul is a jazz man. As a religious leader, he was always in conversation and the tension with the standards and the conventions and the expectations of both religious text and religious tradition. Paul had been given the sheet music of faith, if you will. But throughout his writing, and especially in places like 1 Corinthians 8, as we've heard here today, Paul shows us his own improvisational power. And he shows us that ours is to be an improvisational faith. 1 Corinthians is a compilation of letters that Paul wrote to the church in Corinth. But he wasn't coming up with the material on his own. He was responding to questions that the church had posed to him in previous letters. In his letters, Paul would respond to what he had received, and he would provide instruction, reasoning for how the faithful ought to live together as a church. In the case of 1 Corinthians 8, there had been tension among the Corinthian church members on the matter of eating meat that had been sacrificed to idols. It was a common practice in the day. Some said, don't worry about what you eat. An idol isn't anything anyway, it's just meat. So it doesn't really matter, don't worry about it. These were often the richer members of that society, people who had access to parties where meat was readily and often available to be served. But there were others in the church. They weren't quite as educated. They were probably the poorer faction of the congregation. But many of them had a different perspective on the matter. They did not believe that it was okay to eat meat that had been sacrificed to idols. They didn't believe you could do that at least and maintain a clear conscience. Those who said we ought to abstain from that meat had good reason. In fact, places like Deuteronomy, and Exodus, and even Psalm 106 were pretty clear that eating meat that had been sacrificed to idols was a forbidden practice for the children of God. Nonetheless, in this conflict in Corinth, Paul sides with the ones who see no problem with eating the meat that had been sacrificed to an idol. And here we begin to see that Paul is willing to reimagine, even improvise, upon the ancient tradition and the ancient texts of faith. However, the jazz begins when Paul tells us what should concern us and what we should do about it. Indeed, he confirms that these elite folks are right. They have the correct knowledge on the matter, but that kind of knowledge is not enough if it disregards, or worse, harms others with whom they were in community. Knowledge that they had puffs up. It gives a big ego, even an inflated head, but really, it's full of empty air. Paul plays a better tune. Paul expresses himself in a better way. He says, love is your song. Love is our duty. Or maybe I didn't say that quite right. Love of the other is the demand of the freedom that we have in Christ. Love should guide the notes that we play. And this is where Paul is not bound by the tradition, but he begins to improvise in creative ways. He didn't lay down a new set of standards or laws for the Corinthians to follow. Instead, he showed the power of love through his own example, through his own expression. By the end of the passage, he committed that he would no longer eat meat. But it's interesting, he doesn't say that he just won't eat the meat that's sacrificed to idols. He says, I won't eat any meat if it meant that the community would be strengthened and harm would be mitigated. And that, my friends, is why we all should be vegetarians. Oh, just kidding. Paul wasn't making new rules and new laws. This is a challenging passage for us. Well, let me say, this is a challenging passage to me. I suspect it will be for you too. In part because love is difficult, but also it's difficult to find a similar situation in our time to the one that they faced regarding meat sacrifice to idols. Yet even more than this, in a time of such rampant individualism in our culture, something that certainly pervades church culture as well, it's hard to imagine a situation or a challenge where one group's decision could harm another group's conscience. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting that we don't fight about things and that we don't make each other mad from time to time, but it requires a very deep sense of community to imagine a situation where one group's decision or their action could harm the conscience of another group within the church. Nonetheless, Paul's improvisations are still important, especially as we as a church have committed to our missional priorities, one of them being to work to deepen relationships, both inward and outward. That's what our fourth missional priority would have us putting our energy and our attention toward. And I think if that is our priority, we need to hear the heart of what Paul is saying to the Corinthians. In Corinth, the wealthy ones, even with all their lofty knowledge, were indifferent to others. They didn't care enough about others in the church to even slightly modify their behavior so as not to do harm to another. We don't face the same social concerns in our day that they did then, but the heart of the matter is the same. We're still called to love. And following Paul's kind of jazz, it isn't a new set of rules that we have to follow, but instead it's the free-flowing expression of goodness that is constantly responding to the moment and responding to the other who we meet in each new moment of life. I'm not going to tell you how you have to improvise on love's call, but I would offer a few suggestions as we consider our call to love one another. I'd suggest you might want to linger a little longer after worship each Sunday so that you have the time to have a substantial conversation with someone. Especially linger a bit longer when you greet someone and they say, "I'm good," but everything else inside of them shouts, "I'm falling apart over here." Or reach out to the person that you've been thinking about for weeks and weeks and weeks and invite them to coffee and then be really present with them. Or show up to a protective accompaniment event like we'll have at 7:30 a.m. Tuesday morning. Because people who are facing the horror of ICE need to know that somebody is with them and they are not alone. Or maybe the love of other means doing the courageous work of running for political office and then actually listening to the desires of the people. Hypothetically speaking, of course. Or maybe you're friends with someone who struggles with alcohol. And when you go out to eat with them, you might be so kind as to refrain from ordering a beer so that that friend can avoid even the temptation. or do whatever else it is that can promote the good of another. The point is this: love is not indifferent. It notices the needs of another. It's interesting, in 1 Corinthians 8, I really wanted Paul to say to these Christians who had a weaker conscience, grow up. But Paul doesn't say that. Instead, he places the demand on those who think they're right, that they would respond in ways that promote the good, that create maybe even the possibility of the situation where those who have a weaker conscience could grow up, not in shame, but because they know there's a space of love for them. It isn't a set of rules to be followed. Love is improvisation. Love is jazz that responds to the moment. Love builds up. Knowledge may puff up, but love builds up. And it doesn't just build up the individual, but it builds up the whole community that is held together by love. And as Paul says in our passage today, those who love are the ones who are known by God. And there's nothing puffy or empty about that. For when that kind of news works its way deep into our being, it lifts up, and it builds up, and it bursts forth in raw, powerful, beautiful expressions of love for others. May we love as those who are known by God, and in this we join in the song. Let us love one another, not out of obligation, but let us love as those who know that this is the very purpose. This is the very joy. This is the life of our freedom. And in our self-expression, our very being expresses joy, energy, and passion. When we love like that, we join the movement, we ride the vibrations, and we play our part in all that jazz. Thanks be to God. Amen.